Hello, Lambertville. Thank you for joining us for our quick summary presentation of our budget. I want to also welcome Alex Torpy, our new business administrator. We're going to take a couple of minutes to walk you through a brief summary of a few of the budget issues that we discussed in our meeting on August 6th. If you are interested in learning more, there will be the full slide presentation on the website, and we'll continue to discuss this moving forward in most of our council meetings for the rest of the year. So with that, Alex, do you want to get started on some of our terms that you'll need to know for this presentation?
Sure, thank you. So let's take a moment. Some of the numbers in here we are analyzing with our financial advisors, with our finance team in City Hall. Some of the numbers are live numbers that are coming from budget documents that we're using to prepare the budget for 2020. Some of them are assumptions and estimates when we start forecasting into future years. There are a couple things that are really important to kind of wrap your head around before we get started. And the first two really are the two different types of budgets that you'll hear us talk about a lot. The first is the operating budget, which is sometimes referred to as current fund. This raises revenue through taxes and other means to pay for expenses occurred in that same year. So an example of something that might be in an operating budget is employee salaries. Another example of something that might be in an operating budget is our utility bills or internet service or payments for our healthcare. Those are all things that happen in the operating budget because they are expenses that we incur in the year that we are spending the money. That is contrasted with a capital budget. These are for expenses that typically last at least 5 years. So these are things such as infrastructure, buildings, vehicles, road resurfacing, long-term equipment, anything that we purchase that might last more than 5 years. And the purpose of that is so that taxpayers pay for the item over the course of the life of the item. So if we're building a road that's going to last 10 years, instead of asking everybody this year to pay 100% of the cost for the road, we're spreading that out over the next 10 years so that everybody who uses the road is paying a little bit for it. The next thing that's important to think about is we've been talking a lot about bonds and bonding. This is sort of used as a catch-all way to describe the legal process by which we borrow money to fund an item in the capital budget. There are two different types of bonds or debt that we might incur. One is short-term and one is long-term. The short-term debt, which is typically done through a bond anticipation note, is usually the amount of money that we pay in the first couple years after we have decided to purchase something in the capital budget. We typically only pay a small amount of interest on that short-term debt, and then it has to convert to longer-term debt through a bond sale. And those are generally general obligation bonds. And that's not unlike a mortgage or a car loan or something of that nature. Those general obligations we are then paying the principal and interest on over whatever the life of the item is. That could be 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. Debt service is the amount of money per year that's required by us to pay for whatever those things are that we borrowed. So if you have a loan and every month you have to make a payment, that's basically what debt service is. A structural deficit is what exists when you have basically something where you have a greater cost than you do a revenue. The structural part of that word means that it's not something that just happened one time, but it's something that's built in every single year. It's in the budget structurally. So for example, if you took out a car loan that required a payment of $500 a month, but you only have $400 a month to pay for it, that's sort of similar, right? There's a greater cost than you have coming in to pay for it. And then a fund balance or surplus is basically the amount of money that's left over at the end of the year if you budgeted more than you actually spent. Typically, we want some of this to happen because that allows us to regenerate cash each year, which we can theoretically put in a savings account and use to have cash on hand for unexpected expenses or emergencies.
Thank you, Alex. And just keep in mind as we move forward in this video that all of these terms are going to be coming up, and that if you want to get further involved or if you need more information, you can go on the website and click through our entire presentation. This is just a short, relatively short video about some of the concerns that we have.
Thank you. And we do have one last slide here, just making some comparisons for operating and capital if you want to take a look at that, just to show the distinction between those two budgets, because it is pretty important as we go forward. And the one last thing that we're going to show you quickly is how much it costs and how it's structured to borrow money. This can be sort of an area where a lot of folks don't know that there's a couple different pieces to this and don't always know that borrowing money often in the short term appears much less expensive than it actually is. So if you note on this chart here, there's A, B, and C. Those are the three different ways that you pay for debt that you take out. A is the first part. This is the down payment. So if you're buying something that's $1 million, the down payment is typically 5% that's required. And that $50,000 has to go in the budget in the year that you're buying the item, not unlike a down payment for anything else that you might buy. The next 3 years, and this can be done in a couple different ways, but we're kind of making an assumption based on the way this is typically done, that the next 3 years, the section B, is the interest on short-term debt. So this is the bond anticipation note we mentioned just a few minutes ago, and it's usually about 2%, and you pay that for 3 years. Then the short-term debt goes up to section C, and you can see it's a pretty big jump between B and C. Just the interest on the short-term debt compared to the amount that you're paying when you're doing the principal and interest is a really big difference. And that's just important to understand. You can see at the bottom of the screen, that is the lifetime. These are approximate numbers, but this is basically how the cost is structured when you're borrowing money. You can see that the total amount is obviously more than the amount that you're borrowing because we're paying interest on it. And you can see how that cost is spread out over a 10-year useful life item. So we have a couple different problem statements that we identified in the governing body meeting the other night. Now, we're going to just run through two of the most important ones here.
Absolutely. But if you are interested in learning more, more about these general problem statements, we encourage you to head to the website and read our full report, and we will continue to be discussing this in the public. But for now, we're going to focus on the total amount of debt that we currently have and how we built our structural deficit.
That's right. These are two of the kind of bigger picture items that are really important for us to kind of wrap our heads around. So the total amount of debt accrued, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can measure that. And as the mayor said, you can go on and find the full presentation where we show a couple different slides with a couple different ways to picture the amount of debt that we've accrued. This is one of the nicest ways to see this because if you look on the left, there's three different charts, pie charts here. If you look on the left, there's the blue and the red. The blue is all other spending in your municipal budget. The red is the debt service. That represents 5%. That is a generally accepted best practice. There's different numbers that float out there, 5%, 7%, 8%. Very rarely would you find a best practice that suggests more than 10. 5 is what we're kind of using as the standard best practice. Now, if you move over to the middle pie chart, that is in this year, 2019, how much of our budget is debt service. So you can see it's a pretty big difference between the 5% best practice on the left and the 24% current reality in the middle.
And I'll just note here that because we're spending a quarter of our budget on debt service every year, that basically equates to one of your tax payments being entirely paid towards debt.
That's right. It's a really helpful way to kind of wrap your head around how much of the budget is actually going to debt service. Now, an even more striking kind of visual is the third pie chart all the way on the right. If we continued spending at approximately the current amount, which is about $1 million of capital per year, by 2025, 38% of the budget would be debt service. That's a really significant number. Already where we're at in 2019, very significant. And what's important to kind of understand as part of this is that these debt service payments are like when you take out a loan. There's not really a lot of wiggle room in those payments. You're contractually obligated to make them if it's a loan on a monthly basis or for us for debt service on an annual basis. And the more of your budget that's locked up in items that you have no control over, that decreases your flexibility in being able to change, add new services, cut costs, anything like that, because such a big chunk of it is contractually obligated, and there's really no wiggle room there.
But while this right-hand pie chart is extremely scary, over the course of this, the next few minutes here, we're going to talk a little bit about how we have recognized that this is a problem, and we are identifying solutions through which we won't let our budget get to almost 40% of debt service.
That's right. And in fact, we're going to be talking about some ways to start bringing this number back down with a goal towards 2025 not being at 38%, but being as closer to that 5% as we can get. We want to move in that direction over time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. This is another helpful way of just kind of picturing how much debt has accrued with some real numbers put in there. And so what we've done is sort of shaded this period of time, this 5 years here, and over that 5-year period of time, if we continued spending in the way that spending had been done prior, again, assuming about $1 million a year in capital spending, the city would be obligated to pay that number down, you see at the bottom, $8,669,837 approximately, just in debt service over the next 5 years. It doesn't include tax payments that fund any other service. It's almost $9 million over 5 years just for debt service. That equals approximately $4,200 per average assessed home in Lambertville. Again, just for the debt.
But just keep in mind here that while these approximate how we formally were spending money, the intention here is to note that this is not an appropriate way to continue moving forward in our budget, and that hopefully over the course of time we're going to be rolling this number back down.
That's right. That's right. What we're sort of setting up now is where we're at, how we've gotten to the point that we're at, and where we're at, and the purpose of this entire presentation and discussion is to lay out a new framework for how we're going to approach this going forward. But of course, we can't get into all the solutions until we're all on the same page of what the problems are.
Right.
The second piece that's really important, this kind of big picture issue that we wanted to address in this summary, is the existence of the structural deficit. This has largely been driven by the debt service payments and requirements. So in 2019, there was more than a $400,000, almost $450,000 difference between how much was budgeted for debt service, so how much we actually had prepared to pay for debt in 2019, and how much was actually required to be paid.
Now, a part of this structural deficit deals with some of the other issues that we have with our budgeting process. Because you're contractually obligated to pay for debt service in very specific timelines, you should never be surprised by a debt service payment. But due to lack of capital planning and some other major factors in our budget, oftentimes we were surprised by the amount of total debt service expected in a year, which helped to only increase this structural deficit.
That's right, and one of the values of doing the kind of planning and forecasting that we're currently doing is to try and reduce surprises going forward. Surprises in budgets, not a great combination.
Exactly right.
So this is another way to see some of the real numbers about where we're at from the deficit standpoint. And again, this is largely driven by debt service. So this is the deficit related to debt service payments. You see 3 different colors here on the chart. The light blue on the left bar is how much was budgeted. The dark blue is how much we were obligated to pay in that year. And the yellow is if we continued spending the way that we've been spending. So you'll notice that up until 2019, right, the dark blue and the yellow are the same amounts because that's what it was. The spending was what it was. Going forward from 2020 forward, right, the dark blue is what we are currently already obligated to if we spent no more money in capital, if we took out no new debt for anything. The yellow is if we continued spending along the lines that we've been spending.
Now, I'm going to pause here just to note that there is no possible way for a municipal government to not borrow money. So this navy blue line that assumes no new capital spending really isn't a possibility. And we'll talk about that a little bit more moving forward. But I think it's important to note here that the structural deficit, the difference between the budgeted line and the obligated amount that we were paying over time creates real strain on the budget.
It does, and we definitely recommend that you check out the full slide presentation because there's a little bit more detail about the kinds of problems that this creates. And you can see on this chart, the red line in 2019, that is the deficit. It's the difference between those two things. And again, the structural part is that you can see that it is built in every single year. So we have to make some changes. If you turn your attention over to the right side, if we don't take out any new debt, which as the mayor said, there is no way forward with that. That would mean no road resurfacing, no building maintenance, no purchase of new police cars, nothing like that, which obviously is not a possibility. That means that without any of that, we'd have to find about $2.5 million over the next 5 years to cover the debt service that we are already contractually obligated to. If we continued spending, so that's the dark blue line, if we continue spending at those current levels, the yellow line, with about $1 million in capital each year, we'd have to find approximately $4 million that's not currently budgeted to cover those costs.
So to put this a little more plainly, we can't afford to be borrowing in the way that we have this $1 million a year. And it is our job, both myself and Alex, to find the right number that the city can actually afford to borrow every year moving forward so that we don't find ourselves in this position ever again.
That's right. And the optimistic side here is that there is a way to do that. There is going to be a number that we're going to identify throughout the course of the budget process that is the amount that we can borrow every year. And because of the way debt comes online and offline, as they rotate out and old debt comes off and new debt comes on, right, there's actually a way to do this that does not increase taxes. We're already committed to a certain amount of debt, so we can find a magic number in there that allows us to keep that flat. It's going to be less than we've been spending, but it also allows us to spend without having an additional tax impact with that spending.
And then after we have found that number and we've committed ourselves to more financially prudent budgeting, our obligation to the debt, the overspent debt that we have already accrued and are obligated to ultimately does run out. So by 2025, if we can be diligent about budgeting and tighten our belts, we can get through this period of over borrowed money and get to a place where there's very little tax impact for borrowing for what we need to do.
That's right. And that's a perfect segue into a slide that's just laying out some of the problems and solutions. We are not getting into a ton of detail yet about the solutions. This is just the first conversation, just making sure we're all on the same page as far as what the problems are that we have to address. So you can take a minute to look at this slide, see each of the problems and the solutions that we've identified. We're going to be talking a lot more about the right side of things as we get moving more in the budget process. It's worth noting for now that there are a number of strategies that we're going to be able to put in place that are going to be able to address these problems. There's a lot that's concerning in what we have in front of us, but also these are all addressable. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about that, highly recommend that you check out the full presentation and also kind of stay engaged as we go through the budget process.
And just to keep in mind that both the governing body, myself and Alex, we are all gearing towards this 2025 goal by making tough decisions now and working with the entire community on a more transparent budget process. I think that we as a collective community can get to a place where we have a really healthy budget, and it's not that far in the future.
That's right.
So the last slide that we have here is the process and timeline of our new budget. So we've identified just a few of the many problems that we've seen in the budget thus far in our former budget process. And I think sunlight is often the best disinfectant. So what we're going to do is between now, August 2019, and when we pass the budget in early April 2020 for fiscal year 2020, we're going to have a lot of opportunities for the public to re-engage in our budgeting process. That includes presentations from all of the departments and all of the commissions on how they're going to spend their budget, open public meetings with the governing body where we are finalizing and discussing each line item of both our operating and capital budget. We're going to present a plan for a 6-year capital improvement, which includes all of the debt that we expect to expend over the next 6 years to get us to that 2025 date where we will be in a much healthier situation. So I encourage all of you to watch out for our budget presentations between now and the beginning of January and February. And I hope to be able to talk to each one of you about the ways that we're going to work together to make sure that the city of Lambertville gets onto a healthier, a more stable, and a more transparent budget path. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to seeing you soon.